Welcome to Lead Wisely by WonderTour. We are back talking about Oppenheimer. We've got a special guest on today, but first off, Brian, we don't do intros here on WonderTour. So I'm going to start off with a tough question for you from the movie. What do you do after you change the world? Or in Oppenheimer terms, what happens after the bomb drops?
I love this question. Thanks, Drew. The relevant quote from the movie is it's not a new weapon, it's a new world. And I love this idea that there are some kinds of inventions, some categories of things that you can create that may seem impossible until they aren't anymore. And then after they aren't impossible anymore, after they're real things in the world, really only then can you start to grapple with how is the world going to behave in the new way. How are we going to incorporate this into our thinking, into our planning, into our lives, or, into our trying to survive? So, this movie, this example is like one of these biggest and most dramatic ones possible. But it happens all the time, right? It's very different job to create a new thing than it is to design how all the stakeholders are going to interact with the new thing. And the people who understand the technology the best, the people who propelled it into the world, may or may not have had the best of intentions, may or may not have had an idea of how it was going to be used, but almost invariably, they're not the right people to make all the decisions about what happens next. If you are hyper specialized in something, by definition, you don't have a very broad viewpoint of how you're going to impact society. So this is a really fun, the way that this movie is framed of, on the one hand, the challenge of creating the bomb and building the team. And we'll talk about that maybe more in the next episode. But inverting it on the other hand, once it exists, whose responsibility is it, or whose authority is it, or how do you work together to try to sort out the implications of that? And is that inherently disruptive? It's inherently going to be involving quite a bit of conflict, quite a bit of disagreement, quite a bit of discomfort. And so we see that playing out in this movie with Oppenheimer and his angst over what he's done and his efforts to become somebody who had a real strong influence on the next steps, and many other people, including Strauss's efforts to discredit him and get him out of the conversation because there were different people that wanted to have a say in how things went. So I really love that element of this. And the what do you do after they change the world is, there's maybe not going to be a simple answer. It'll be fun to talk about it today, but it's not going to be you personally get to decide, right? It's almost invariably, who do you talk to? How do you behave? How do you cooperate after the world has changed so that you can incorporate that into the new reality? That's going to be a fun conversation, guys.
Yeah, and I would almost say that the question, maybe we need to reframe it, and it should be more about, how are you going to deal with it? Because it's not really what are you going to do, like you said, because you almost lose creative control of your invention at some point once it is let loose into the culture, into a system, and it becomes for the users of that system, for the people of the world, or against them, but one or the other there, or both in this case. And at that point, you lose creative control. But I think one opportunity we have is to understand that and to know when we're inventing things, when we're building things, when we're leading others to do so or encouraging others to do so, that we need to prepare for the inevitability that this isn't about us. As we say here on WonderTour often, back from Doctor Strange, it's not about you. So trying to maintain control of that all the way from end to end, from cradle to grave, it's just a pipe dream. And instead, we should look at, what mindsets do we want to have? What tactics do we want to have to either be a part of the process along the way or encourage others to be able to continue on with the principles that and the values that we had when we developed that solution.
And even to go into it with the mindset of, this is WonderTour, this is a leadership podcast. If you are involved in creating something new in the world, which is, I think, going to be a significant portion of our audience, especially if you're in a leadership role of trying to push that thing out into the world, to have awareness up front that there are some parts of that planning you simply can't do, but it still has to be done once it gets out. Once you've figured out how the thing is going to work, then the really hard work begins. That's almost the more complex, fuzzier, more challenging piece of introducing a technology or introducing a change into the world. So I'm really looking forward to that conversation today. I think we'll go ahead and get started here, right? Welcome to episode 107. I am Brian Nutwell.
And I'm Drew Paroz.
I'm David Beltran del Rio.
And we are on a journey to become better leaders by touring fantastic worlds and inspiring lore by going on this WonderTour.
We connect leadership concepts to story context because it sticks to our brains better. You can find out more at WonderTourPodcast.com. All right, he's been sitting here. It's time to introduce our Christopher Nolan, our nuclear buff expert, and also a good friend of the podcast, Dave Beltran del Rio. Dave, do you want to give us a short background? What are you all about?
Thanks, Drew and Brian, for having me on. I'm a big fan, as you know. We've worked together starting, almost 10 years ago now. We've known each other for a long time, and we never hesitate to talk about movies, especially Christopher Nolan movies, which we all love. And I love that approach of what ideas can we take from the structure of these stories to help us become better leaders. All the conversations that we've had about that have always stuck with me and helped me quite a bit in my own challenges to become a better leader. I was particularly interested in this one because I am certainly a Christopher Nolan super fan, as we've discussed a bunch, but I'm also a nuclear history super fan of sorts. It's a strange thing maybe to be a fan of. It's a fascinating story that resonates with me for reasons that maybe some I understand and some I don't, but a lot of it is the scale of the effort to create this weapon and the characters involved who still seem like otherworldly giants, intellectual giants who achieved this remarkable thing. Uh, and then they achieved it and it was horrible. And they kind of knew that that's where things were going. But then, faced with the reality of it, it's interesting to see the directions that these guys went, or anyone who was involved in the project. But the people we talk about most are these, sort of these heroic scientists that we know well, and Oppenheimer being sort of central to it. So I just sort of can't get enough of thinking about what it must have been like, as well as the processes that they were going through. First of all, just to get the work done, which is in itself remarkable, mostly because they were inventing the basic physics while they were going, which is, usually there's, you come up with an idea, you develop it in a lab, maybe you build some experiments, and it being scaled up into an industrial process is something that happens with a whole different set of people over maybe decades. But they did this all in just a few short years, working at Los Alamos. And so then beyond that, then all of a sudden they've done it, and now what? And I think that's part of what we're planning to talk about today.
Yeah, to pick up from where we left off in section one with our big question, where we were asking ourselves, what do you do after you change the world? I think we all have a lesson to learn here. And I want to kick it back to you, Dave, talking about the turning point and the deployment period, because most of us have built something in our lives. And there's this implementation period where you make the thing, you test it out, you hand it out to people, or the intended users or whatever. And then suddenly it gets adopted, and then now it's not really yours anymore, and it's societies or it's your user bases or your stakeholders, and all of that work, that blood, sweat, and tears that you put into that thing for whatever reason you did, whether it was an app that you made, a book that you wrote, a play that you put on, whatever it is, now it's in the hands of the users. And at that point, everything can change. It doesn't matter what your testing said. It doesn't matter how you intended for it to be used. It can be used in whatever way the users have in mind. And so I just want to take this quote here and maybe kick it back to you with this: making the tool is not making the system. So once you reach that turning point and you start to get into the deployment period, now the system is changing. The world, in terms of Oppenheimer, has seen the power of the bomb, and they have to change the global systems, the political systems, economic systems, whatever it might be, in response to that thing. So, Dave, talk to us a little bit about it from the perspective of Oppenheimer, with all that knowledge that you have.
Uh, yeah, no, and I was thinking about this when Brian was introducing. I was ready to jump in, and so I'll jump in now. The thing that gets me about this particular story is that, at least in my life, when I'm building machine learning model to try and sell more cars or understand customer behavior. First of all, the consequences are not that significant. Second of all, we all basically agree that this is something that is relatively harmless. And also, it's something that's well understood. And that's the part I want to talk about, which is that these guys were building something that wasn't understood. And because they themselves didn't know if they were going to succeed or not, even at Trinity, they still weren't sure. But they were also the only people on the planet who had some insight into what it would mean if they did succeed. I think that there was a lot of thinking about it of the few people in, say, the military or the government who knew what was going on, that this would just be, it's just like a regular bomb, it's just bigger. But the atomic scientists, one thing that characterizes the struggle that they had was that they didn't know. Well, they knew the scale of these weapons and how they could be world changing. But they also expected that they would have some ownership of it after the fact. So I think that one of the things that was done really well in the movie was when they're done succeeding, suddenly it's out of their hands. And they were surprised by this, especially because I think they correctly believed that they were some of the few people on Earth who actually had put some thought into what the implications were. And to be almost completely cut out of the process after the test was shocking and very disappointing to them.
Yeah, that was a piece of the story that I think certainly I didn't know from even having some military history buff in my background too, was that the extent to which they were cut out immediately, that the fact that they learned about the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings at the same time as everybody else in the world did on the news, because nobody told them what the plan was or how it was going to be involved or asked their advice for anything. It's like they just packed stuff up in a crate and took it away, and a couple of weeks later you hear that something's happened. So yeah, I'm sure that was shocking to them, right? And the extent to which we talked about this, the new system has to kind of come into existence as only after the new thing appears, and everybody's sort of struggling to deal with it. But the new system is never a blank slate. Like it's the politicians that are in place, it's the military that's in place, it's the world order that's in place, it's the people's habits that are in place, is your starting point for the new system. And it's of course, going to really struggle to adapt to this new thing, but you don't get to just like, okay, now we're going to ask the scientists how to design a society and a set of political rules that work with nuclear bombs. Like that's not how it ever goes. Right? It's
I
like,
think they might have, some of them might have expected a little bit of that, and that's not how it went.
I think some of the scientists did, but I don't think anybody outside of at Los Alamos it even occurred to them that they were just going to put Oppenheimer in charge of political policy, right?
Well, they did have quite a bit of influence and made some public statements. So there's some very interesting articles written by many of them, Oppenheimer especially, about what their vision for how to live safely in this new world that they had created. And they had their seat at the table, but ultimately they weren't the ones that got to decide. And there's that wonderful and somewhat chilling scene with Truman in the movie where we find out sort of the mentality there, and Oppenheimer's sort of his eyes are open to the reality of it. And I think that was more characteristic of what happened later. Unless, of course, as a scientist, you were willing to go along with the powers that be, which were typically government leadership and military. You sort of agreed with them. If you didn't, you were just a side note. And I think that's what happened to Oppenheimer.
And I think we have to look at the other side of it too, right? That it's not necessarily the case that the people that build the thing are the people that understand the existing systems in the world and cultures in the world and stuff the best. And so as much as it might feel like you're right when you build the data science model to tell your business or your customers or whoever how to use that model, it's not always you're right, because once you've built it and you've put a thing out into the world, it's up to those people now to be able to handle it. And there may be better people than me or better people than us to be able to figure out how to use that thing. Not to say that we shouldn't have a plan in place when we build something, when we introduce new technology for how people are going to use it, but to say that we should be open to others' perspectives on how to handle that, and even to expect different perspectives to well up and to expect opposition. If you go and you implement a new system, let's say you change the way that your company's operating system runs. that's not necessarily the values, but everything on top of that. You're going to change the way that you do your planning, your projects, all that stuff. Okay. That's a pretty common thing that happens here in the age of digital transformation. Well, cool, you could be the expert on that, but now that you went to implement it, there are people who are the expert on your organization. And they've been there for a long time, and rightfully, they want a seat at the table to understand how this new world order is going to run.
Yeah.
So when that happens, it's okay. And I think as leaders, we have to figure out how to, again, if we want to be a part of both conversations, it can be really helpful to have what we call interlopers on WonderTour, or people that can kind of, kind of go in and invade this different territory that is not necessarily comfortable or well known, already has inhabitants in it, but yet do it in a compassionate and caring way where it might feel invasive, but we're trying to move towards a solution together.
Mm-hmm. I think that the history of technology, you have, especially recently, a lot of cases where the people who develop a technology aren't very well placed to develop it further, productionalize it, market it, sell it, right? I think that it would be best if we could all collaborate on those things better, but in practice, it hasn't always worked out that way.
The personality required to make a new thing, especially an unforeseeable or nearly impossible new thing, even if it's not at the scale of an atomic bomb, right? Even like a Twitter or something, right? That the personality it requires to bring that into the world, you have to have some degree of optimism. I'm going to try this crazy thing, and not only am I going to succeed and it's going to work, but then other people are going to like it and they're going to use it. Like, those are both ridiculously optimistic viewpoints, right? And so you tend to imagine the best case scenario, both of it working and of people using it for the way you imagined, right? Getting the benefit you imagined. And it gets out of the world, and you're not picturing cyberbullying. You're not picturing the Arab Spring. You're not picturing like all of the different ways that this technology that you created could potentially turn into something else or facilitate bad behaviors that people have been wanting to do for centuries anyway, or millennia anyway, right? Yeah, we had a generation of we had a generation of internet tech leaders who were very, who came out of the hippie movements, right? Who came out of the utopian thinking, and that didn't pan out quite that way. And then we had a generation of leaders that came out of the make money in any way possible is good kind of thinking, and that really didn't pan out very well either, right? It had side effects as well. And so, there's, as these assumptions get questioned, yeah, the Zuckerbergs and Bezoses of the world aren't maybe the people that you would want making social policy.
And I think this goes back to what we've already talked about, Brian, in previous episodes in this series on human machine interaction. Technology and tools on their own don't really have a purpose. You have to decide what is your purpose with this thing, and then society will decide what the purpose is for this thing. So, to be very clear and principled in the development and deployment of things is absolutely critical. The just overly optimistic viewpoint on one side that things will just sort themselves out and the pain is just a part of the process, when the pain is inequality and all the things that come with that when we release new technology into the world without proper testing or without the right moderation and governance. And then obviously on the other side of that, as Dave said earlier on, it'd be nice if we could just know all of the bits and pieces we were putting together into a larger solution before we just started strapping them together and throwing them out to the users to test and say, see if this works. Does this solve your problem? But at the age that we're in, things move quickly and things seem to be moving faster and faster. And while we can argue here on WonderTour, is that right or is that wrong? One thing that we can't do is get a lot of control on that. So I think that we now are in a much closer state to what they were in before, where sure, we're picking up known theories and concepts and building blocks and putting them together, but a lot of times it's happening so fast that it's not getting the level of rigor that it maybe would have had 50 or 100 years ago before it just gets deployed out to the population. And that is definitely scary. All right, so let's go ahead then. Perfect segue into the mountaintop. Dave, can you talk to us about what our mountaintop moment is in Oppenheimer for episode 107?
What we were discussing was the very end. So there's been this mystery set up about what did Oppenheimer say to Einstein. Strauss is obsessed with this idea and furious at Oppenheimer and exacts this terrible revenge. So at the end of the movie, we finally get some insight into what it was that happened in that moment, and it's not quite historical, but they discuss the calculations for whether or not the detonation of such a powerful weapon would ignite the atmosphere and burn the entire atmosphere and destroy the planet. This was true. They did have to figure this out. An energetic enough explosion might burn the atmosphere. They didn't know. And they did end up computing, that it was highly unlikely. As of course, one of the jokes in the movie was it wasn't, 100% certain that they weren't going to destroy the entire planet with the Trinity test. When I was rewatching the movie recently, this moment really struck me because Oppenheimer is, of course, asking himself, is it possible that we did create a chain reaction that will destroy the world, just not at the time frame that he had in mind, that he could foresee what became nuclear proliferation and the Cold War and the great risk that we would have enough of these weapons to destroy the planet. And they were also aware at the time that the development of more powerful weapons, the so-called super bomb, was possible. So we get this insight into Oppenheimer's thinking. I thought that Brian's point of bringing up optimism was interesting because, of course, these guys were working mostly out of fear that the Nazis were developing these weapons. But as they were doing it, the optimism crept in a funny way, in that they started convincing themselves, some of them anyway, that because these weapons were so powerful, it would make future wars impossible. That there would never be war again because war would mean destruction of the entire planet. And that was that. It's funny to think about that because, of course, we did end up in that situation. The whole planet has not been destroyed yet. That's kind of the concern. And in that moment, Nolan, in a way that I think was sort of uncharacteristically direct for him, is talking to us, the audience, and saying, "We're not out of the woods yet. This is still a huge danger. Those weapons are still in their silos with more than enough power to destroy the world."
So there was kind of two inflection points there, right? One was we now live with the sense that we have the power to destroy our own world, that we actually do control our own fate and destiny to a degree to which we never did before. So that was a real inflection point. When we talked in the pre-show, one of the things you said was like, this had not happened before. No small group of people had ever come up with a new thing that didn't exist before that was actually that potentially influential over the fates of everyone else.
It's hard to imagine what the world was like before that. I can't, because I grew up in the
Right.
world where. So I think that's what the other thing that got me about the movie rewatching it was that they went from a world where, yes, there were wars and they were quite destructive at that point, but it wasn't like everyone was going to die, to a world where actually everyone might die.
Right. So that's a huge inflection point. But then the other interesting thing that you mentioned in the pre-show was that has then inevitably become a metaphor that we now use when thinking about new technologies, right? And we talk about social media, we talk about AI in the same way as, oh, are we about to do it again? Are we about to create another existential threat? Are we about to alter the fabric of our decision making in some fundamental way? And that's been really interesting to watch. Like, are these things the same? But as a leader, when we already saw it happen once, we already saw the bomb be created. We already saw nuclear non-proliferation. We already saw live through the drills and the fear. Are we doing it again? Could we possibly do it differently? Could we possibly not invent AI? It doesn't look like it. It doesn't look like anybody would be willing to not invent the AI on the off chance that it destroys us all. Like that
It's a
appears to
weird
be
thing
not a thing.
about these stories, right? Because we
Right.
know the risk and we do it anyway because we kind of
Right.
have to. I mean, I think that's the thing that when I first became fascinated with these stories, reading them was, I think I had in mind this notion that, well, at some point along the way, why didn't they just decide not to do it or to not to drop the bomb on Hiroshima or not to develop these arsenals? And you look at the story and it reads like a Greek tragedy. They really didn't have choices. They had to develop the weapon because if the Nazis did, well, we can all imagine what that world would have been like. And we do. There's shows about it, right? But
So
beyond.
then,
Sorry.
yeah. So then the
Yeah.
best case scenario is as a leader, you aspire to be Oppenheimer, right? You aspire to do the thing and then to fight against the thing expanding. So, Drew, what do you think about this? Like, who's your role model in this movie?
Yeah, it's really tough to find a role model in this movie. It's almost real life, that's what biopics are. So that's the challenge. But what stuck out to me while you guys were talking here is that while maybe we don't have a choice if we're going to continue working towards artificial general intelligence, people are going to keep marching towards the profits that's going to drive the efficiency, that's going to drive the whatever that's going to drive at the cost of who knows what, because the cycle's basically already started, in the same way that as soon as it was possible and people believed that they could build a nuclear bomb, it seemed like it had to happen, basically just due to World War II and the buildup that was happening there. But I do think that's where we as leaders have a choice and have meaningful consequences of our choice. And it's to be purpose driven, to continue to drive values, to continue to mentor others, to teach people how to properly make decisions. And obviously, more than that, to learn how to make proper decisions ourselves, because it is very challenging as a human every day to have to wake up and be put in front of me decisions of, it's not necessarily like big decisions of life or death, but it is the small chipping away decisions of life or death that determine, what type of world are we building. And the way that we do that is by building up our own character. And that's why in WonderTour we say character is destiny, because it's not the only thing that we're doing, but building up a character of service, building up a character that is magnanimous, where we are focused on serving other people, not serving ourselves. That is one way that no matter what technology, no matter what tools come out of it, doesn't matter if something comes that ends up destroying large parts of the population, because guess what? As much as that would be an absolute tragedy, the purpose lives on, the mission lives on. Humans continue to care for each other, to serve each other over themselves. And that is really the only thing that seems to be able to move past all of the doomsday clocks and everything else. As we look at all of the terrible things that have happened over the course of human society, the only thing that sticks out to me that works, and I think this is what Oppenheimer, this is kind of what he learns, is, oh crap, maybe in all of this, it was a little bit of a selfish pursuit in addition to trying to serve the world. And really, I'm going to have to dedicate the rest of my life to trying to serve the world now because of the decisions that I've made. And don't we all need to wake up every day with that reminder that my job is to serve the people that I come in contact with today?
Yeah, no big challenge, right? No, just something little like that.
That's what I'm known for. I'm sorry. I have to come in with that because that is the way that my mind works. I have to see the bigger picture and then realize the cost. It is a dreadful cost almost. It is a cost that is hard to even stomach, that I will have to wake up and give up myself every single day if I want the world to be better around me. But that there's still joy in doing that. That I can find joy in giving life to other people, and that in turn will be recursive and it will give life back to me, not as an objective, not as a direct result, but as an indirect result. And that's why that's kind of the magic of magnanimous, that when I give to somebody else without expecting anything in return, that's compassion, as we talked about in the compassion series. It
It's not a
somehow,
sacrifice.
yeah.
Yeah, it's not a sacrifice if it is the thing that you are uniquely suited to do, right? If it is the thing that you are, uniquely engaged in doing. So, yeah. So how do you carry this around every day, Dave? Obviously, not just the looming threat behind us, but the leadership challenge of, like, I'm making new things and I'm also trying to build a team and an organization and a structure that contributes.
Well, part of it is the fascination with these stories is because they are such a great example to all of us. Even the darkest ones, you find optimism, you find hope for the future, and you find lessons learned. I think that's exactly right, Drew, what you were saying. A lot of these guys, after this remarkable thing that they took part in, leaders of a sort that they almost certainly wouldn't have been otherwise. In most cases, that was a good. So I think that's part of my fascination with this story. And for instance, other similar ones, like say the space race, you had something very similar happen. And I think the development of the atomic bomb was a model for these sorts of things, where you bring together government, industry, the people sort of as a whole to achieve this remarkable thing. Everything I do is, of course, on a much smaller scale, but all of us are part of these bigger systems. And I mean, I don't think it's unusual at all to find inspiration in the way that these projects were carried out. It's been funny to me. I've been revisiting these stories just in this past year, which coincides with the time that I'm managing my small team and developing things, and realizing how hard that is, and how hard it is to keep things moving. And then looking at someone like Groves in the movie and thinking, there's these people were just remarkable, just the force that they brought to these things and their organizational skills. In the movie, Isidore Rabi is Oppenheimer's friend who consults him, and he has an infamous quote about Leslie Groves, a general who was in charge of the project overall, played by Matt Damon in the movie. And Groves was quite a character. He had built the Pentagon and wanted to go serve actually in theater and combat, and was told, no, you have to work on this special secret project, which then he found out about. And Groves, one of his first jobs was deciding who should be the leader of the project, the scientific leader at Los Alamos. And Robbie had a quote that Groves wasn't largely considered to be a genius, but that his selection of Oppenheimer was a stroke of genius. And I always thought this quote was a little bit unfair because I suspect Robbie was using as his model for genius one of these physicist, mathematician geniuses that he knew so well. He was one himself, and didn't think that that applied to Groves. But Groves was an organizational genius. I can't imagine the mindset, the relentlessness that it would take to wrangle all those resources together to see that project through. So for me, it's a bit of just an inspiration, something to live up to every.
No, that's
That's
awesome. I love that. And I totally agree. I think when thinking about this story with a very minimal knowledge, right? You think about Einstein's theories, and you think about Oppenheimer and all the scientists kind of solving the hard technical problems. And that's, as an engineer, that's admirable. As an engineer, that's like, yeah, this is amazing. Like, inventing new physics on the fly, and, discovering how the world works and beating the Nazis to the bomb. Like it's all really cool stuff. But watching the movie and thinking about the story as a leader, as a mental model that's useful for me to think about how to conduct my life or conduct challenges. I love the pivots. I love the Groves wanted to go fight in the South Pacific, but they put him in charge of this ridiculous program with physics that may or may not have actually existed, with people that were all, some degree of savants and some degree of idiots,
These
socially.
prima
And he
donnas,
just
yeah.
Right, and he just jumped right into it, and and took a hold of that. And Oppenheimer, who did the thing that he was probably felt like he was put on the earth for, the thing that he was the most uniquely suited in the world to do, is to create this bomb, and then, if not seamlessly, very intentionally, with a lot of willpower, pivoted to, my job is to now be a public figure and a voice of reason, and the one person who has the gravitas to try to get the public to think deeply about what it is we're doing here and how we should behave in the future. And that pivot is, both of those pivots are really inspirational. Like, even if you don't feel like it's your core skill set, even if it's not the thing that you thought you signed up for, sometimes the challenge presents itself that you are actually the only person that can solve. And running really hard at that and taking it seriously and putting out the energy into the world, like Drew was saying, about it's not about me, and I've got to get all these people around me to be able to do what's necessary. That's really cool. That's a WonderTour lesson that I'm going to hold on to for sure.
And because it's WonderTour, I've got to bring in the through line that Nolan lays out. For those of you who've been along for the ride, or are just Nolan buffs, you'll know that Christopher Nolan generally starts his movies by telling you just about everything you need to know about the film in that opening scene. And in Oppenheimer, we get this opening scene where we have Oppie choosing or putting a poisoned apple on his professor's desk, and then going back and trying to remove the poisoned apple before his professor eats it. And so we obviously have in our, in the world culture, this idea of the apple as the choice, back from the story of Adam and Eve in the garden, right? The choice that humans can make of, are you going to take wisdom on your own hand, like in your own eyes, basically? Are you going to make the decision for the world, or for, the universe, or whatever, of what you think is right? Or are you going to do the right thing, the altruistic thing, whatever it is, and put it down and trust? And it's so brilliant because he sets it up with this where Oppenheimer has to choose. Are you going to take wisdom in your own hands? Are you going to go build this thing and just let it loose on the world? And then at the end, he bookends it with what we had talked about with the mountaintop, with Einstein, with a reflection on that of what happens now. Did we let loose a evil into the world that will never be put back into a cage, basically? And doesn't that then tie back to the idea of just considering our decisions, considering like you said with Groves, who is he going to put in charge? How is he going to design his organization? As we'll talk about in episode 108, our next episode on Oppenheimer. I mean, those are huge decisions that change the world. And to really, for each one of us, to recognize that we may not make decisions today or in our lives have the gravity of the decisions that some of these figures in this movie made, but our decisions have the gravity to change our local communities. Our decisions have the gravity to change our families, to change our workplaces, whatever it might be. And they can absolutely improve the lives of the people around us, bringing life, or, demean people, create inequality, whatever it might be. Just because we made decisions in our past that lead us one direction and that created a negative impact or negative feedback on us or on the world doesn't mean that we can't, as Brian said, like Oppie did, the next day decide to make a decision. You get to choose each day what your decision is. So you can pick. For us, just because we took the apple doesn't mean that we need to continue and continue and continue to take the apple every single day like it's Groundhog Day. One day you can decide not to. You just put the apple away.
Can't unpoison the apple, but you can spend the rest of your life trying to keep people from eating it.
All right, let's hit some key takeaways.
Let's do it.
I think you just hit one of our key takeaways, Brian. You can't poison the apple, but you can spend the rest of your life trying to keep people from eating it, right? So that's what we just talked about in the last segment. But I mean, you can't change what you've done in the past, but you do get to choose and make new decisions each day. Just like Oppenheimer did, we each get to choose each day, who we're going to be. And humans are capable of changing. That's one of the most incredible things about us. Number 2, we talked about kind of that this really reads like a tragedy, and that's because it's very realistic, and it's the world that we live in today. So sometimes we live in the tragedy, and the answer is not to reframe it as a comedy or to reframe it as a drama or to reframe it as a hero's journey or something like that. It's not that easy because life has disasters. Life has challenges. Life has things that we let out of the cage that seemingly can't be put back into the cage. And so for us, we talked about with our big question, what do you do after you change the world and it is irreversibly changed? Well, I think part of that is, taking part in the solution, even if you don't get to lead it. If you're going to be like Oppie, choosing to continue to make the right decisions, to be willing to be vulnerable about the decisions you made in the past, even going back on them or being, admitting you're wrong when you're wrong. That's something that's hard for a lot of us. That it's hard for me, but I try to do it. Go back and admit when I'm wrong. We also talked about how leaders have to navigate the installation, the turning point, and the deployment periods, and how just because you're this great technical leader or you got to lead the technical people who developed a solution doesn't mean you control that solution. So prepare with that in mind that, at some point that solution goes back to the world, goes back to your users, whoever it might be, and it's their opportunity to use it, to iterate on it, to change the world. So how are you going to instill values? And really, again, what do we do on WonderTour? Why do we do any of this? Because we believe that we want to be magnanimous leaders and we want more magnanimous leaders in the world, which leads us to another key takeaway. We may not have a choice in the new tech that's going to get introduced. Each of us right now probably has different and some of the same fears about generative AI, artificial general intelligence, basically the singularity, all of the scary and exciting and hopeful and potentially disastrous things that are going to happen over the next handful of years. We don't control that. We can't put the animal back in the box, but what we can do is we can choose each day who we're going to be, and we can choose to fight for other people. We can choose to sacrifice our time to be able to teach people what we know. We can read, we can learn, we can have conversations with people, and most importantly, we can serve other people around us, because no matter who you are, you don't have to be Oppenheimer to make an impact.
Yeah, the only other thing I had, which I think you really you got into with the leadership behaviors, was really just the being open to the pivot, being open to the idea that there might be a thing in the world that you are uniquely qualified to do that isn't the thing you thought you were going to do. That you might see something open up that just needs to be done, and you're the person standing there, and being open to that pivot as a leader to like go run at it, and then bring as many people into that world as you can with you, be as collaborative as you can about crafting the solution, but being aware that you might have an undesired leadership role thrust upon you, which is exactly what happened to both Groves and Oppenheimer in this movie.
And I think asking questions along the way is one thing, and I think that's exactly sort of why the three of us are here talking about it. That that maybe in certain large ways you can't change the outcomes or where these things are going, but all of us need to be more thoughtful about the things we build and the things we do. And I think that asking those questions and sort of thinking about those things during the development, and thinking about stories like these during the development of something new, can only help us do these things more consciously and more compassionately, which I hope is the goal.
Yeah, absolutely. Good questions.
Awesome. Well, Brian, why don't you wrap us up?
All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. This has been a really fun discussion. Thank you so much, Dave, for joining us and providing all your insights and your background in this space. We're going to keep the conversation going with episode 108. We're going to keep talking about Oppenheimer. We're going to talk. We're going to do things backwards, which is not unusual for us. We talked high level and what happens after the bomb. So now we're going to go back and talk about how would you design an organization for a very specific purpose. So really looking forward to having you all join us for that one. Thanks so much for spending time with us. And until next time, just remember, as always, character is destiny.